But this morning, as we finish up Journeying to the Cross, this morning we want to look specifically at the Garden of Disbelief. And if you've been with us, hopefully, for most of the month of March, you understand and remember that we've been on a journey that has taken us to different gardens throughout Scripture. And these gardens we've seen have various importance to not only individuals that we find recorded for us within Scripture, but also we find for all mankind. We've been talking all the way back in the first Sunday of March about mankind and his beginnings there in the Garden of Eden and all that took place as far as the creation of everything. And then we also saw how death entered to mankind through sin. And this morning we come to the garden with an empty tomb. So we do so this morning. It's somewhat kind of give us a spoiler alert with a few things that unfortunately when we come to this story, we're familiar with it. Spoiler alert, as we all are aware, is something that happens normally with a movie or a book or a television program where we haven't seen it yet and somebody comes along and they're maybe giving a review or writing a review about it, and all of a sudden they kind of put in spoiler alert just to let you know that they're going to tell you some important part of the story. And if you don't want to be kind of ruined as far as your enjoyment of it, you can know to kind of turn the channel, stop reading, whatever it is, just to prevent yourself from having the plot destroyed for you. Or if it's a ball game or something that you've had recorded and don't want to know, then they'll tell you or it hasn't been broadcast yet. Just kind of let you know, and so you can hold back. It's interesting, the University of San Diego did a study. They had a short story, and these people that were involved in the study, they gave them the option of either having, they gave some of them their spoiler alert. They told them everything that was going to take place in the short story. And another part of the group, they told them nothing. And one of the things that they found out is that those who enjoyed the short story, 60% of them enjoyed the short story more who had received the spoiler alerts. Those who had received what was going to take place enjoyed it 60% more than those who hadn't. And I think somewhat that's becoming more and more of our society. We kind of don't want to be surprised. We kind of want to know what's going on. Many of us will remember Lucy and her love for the Buffalo Bills. It took me a few years before I realized she rarely watched the game live. Now, she would listen to it on the radio a little bit or whatever, but she taped it. She'd find out how the end was because she was too nervous to go through the game live, and then she would watch it once she knew how it was going to turn out. And sometimes people are like that. We don't want to be able to be surprised. We want to know what's going on. And so this morning, as we look at this story, there are some spoiler alerts that we have to understand. One of the spoiler alerts that we understand is that everyone dies. This isn't new to us. Everyone dies. In fact, if you were with us in Albion on Friday night, we focused on the fact that even Jesus died. Second spoiler alert as we meet together in celebration is the fact that Jesus did not remain dead. That he rose again. We celebrate today on Easter Sunday the fact that Jesus is alive. And so you and I somewhat come to this Easter story with a little bit of a spoiler alert attitude that we know what happens. It's familiar to us. Nothing really is going to catch us off guard because we've heard it before. We've read it before. We've seen various media portrayals of it. Friday afternoon, I still enjoy the opportunity just to take a couple hours and watch The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's film that gives just probably even as gory and as brutal as it is, just a light version maybe of what it actually was that Jesus went through. And so this morning as we come to Easter, we think of the cross. We think of the two thieves that were crucified with Jesus at the same time. We think of those who hurled insults at Christ. We think of the moment of his death as he cried out. As there was an earthquake. As the temple curtain was torn in two that opened up the way to the Holy of Holies. We know it all. We know Jesus died. We know that he was buried. And then we read in John 19, verse 41, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish preparation. And since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. There was a garden. There was a garden, and in that garden was a tomb where nobody had ever been laid. In that garden was where Jesus was crucified. In that garden was where his body was taken and placed within the tomb. And Friday comes to the end. They go through Saturday. We read in the next chapter of John, as we did earlier, but it's important for us to hear the story, to remember it. That early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter, and he reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, and he went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise back from the dead. Then the disciple went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which translated means teacher. Imagine this scene. Mary has spent almost 3 years following Jesus around. She has seen his miracles. She has heard his teaching. But here in the garden, she turns. She believes the one that is before her is the gardener. She doesn't recognize Jesus. Think how amazing that is. How difficult it is for some of us to perceive that this woman would be able to look and not realize it was Jesus. Some of you are maybe struggling with that. Some of us don't struggle with that because our minds work in such a way that we don't focus on things real well. I've had to apologize more than once in my lifetime, and I'm sure that probably I've done it sometimes here with you folks, and maybe you've been generous and I haven't had to apologize or yet, anyhow. But when I go shopping, I have complete and total tunnel vision. I want to get something, I'm in there for a purpose, and I'm walking and I'm only looking to do what I came to do. And I know, and there's been times where people have almost grabbed my arm to say, "Hey, hi. And I was like, I didn't even see you. I didn't even recognize you. My eyes weren't even focused to see you. I just wanted to get this and get out. And if I've done that to you, I'm sorry. And if I do that to you in the future, understand I'm sorry. Stand in front of me. Or, well, probably even hit me so that I stop. Because if you stand in front of me, I'll probably just try and get around you. You know, but there are times where that happens. There are other times where we find ourselves in certain situations where, you know what, we see somebody and we know that we should know them, we know that we should know their name, and we draw that blank. We may even start the conversation. We just don't use their name because we don't have their name in our mind. Just simply don't recognize. Then all of a sudden, maybe while we're talking with them, the light bulb will go off. Maybe it's afterwards. The light bulb will go off. I had that on Tuesday with Jaden. We were in a store and there was a girl at the checkout, and I said to Jaden, I said, I know her for some reason. The light bulb still hasn't gone off. How I know her or where I know her from. But it just happens. And here on this early Sunday morning, we find that Mary, she turns the first time and she looks at Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener. She doesn't recognize him. This morning I want to focus on why Mary could possibly have mistaken Jesus for the gardener. Mistaken Jesus for being someone else. I think the first reason is it's dark. It's dark. We read that in the first verse of chapter 20 there, that they went early in the morning. Early in the morning, it's still dark. Probably wasn't even what you and I would call daybreak. And I got up this morning, I looked out and I said, oh, won't go sailing today because it's a red sky. Sailor's warning. I hadn't thought I would either. But I don't even think that when they started to make their way there, that it was even like that. Because again, remember, you and I, we're dealing with something that dark isn't dark. You and I actually have to hunt out places that are dark in our society today. We have so many areas and so many places that really, I think they call it light pollution, affects us. We get a light from a yard light. We get a light shining from perhaps a home that they leave some kind of light on all through the night coming out their window. We get lights that come from street lights in town. We get lights from different places. We have lights that are always on somewhere that diffuse the darkness and give us some kind of light. Remember, this isn't then. They wouldn't have had that taking place. They wouldn't have had all that light pollution removing the darkness. And then remember as well that this is in the garden. And as we talked about the gardens in that day and around that area, those gardens were often covered with trees and overhangs that would cause it to even be darker inside the garden. And so maybe it was just that aspect that it was dark, and Mary just kind of took a quick look and she thought, you know what? This is the gardener. She mistook Jesus because it was dark. Second, she may have mistook Jesus for the gardener because Mary believed Jesus was dead. She wasn't looking for a Jesus who was alive. She and the other women had come to the tomb with the spices and oils and everything that they used to anoint a dead body. That's what she came looking for. The last picture that Mary had of Jesus was him hanging on a cross. That's what's in her mind's eye. That's what she sees. That's what she has as a picture when she's walking towards the tomb. She is looking to put and anoint the body with the spices and everything like that on a body that she had seen hanging on a tree. She wasn't looking for a resurrected Jesus. She wasn't looking for someone that would be walking around in the garden. Mary was looking for a lifeless, dead body that she could pour the burial spices on. It wasn't even in her mind the possibility that Jesus could be alive and walking around. So it was dark. Mary believed that Jesus was dead. Third, Mary, she was scared. She was scared. With all the events of the past week, with Friday and seeing Jesus crucified, she, I'm sure, had some fear that she herself, as a follower of Jesus, was at risk. And then as they made their way to the tomb, all these other events that accompanied his resurrection. Listen, on the Friday, she had experienced it when he died, when he gave up his last breath. There were the earthquakes. There were the reports of those who had already died coming back to life. Matthew describes what took place. He said, and when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit, died. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. She was concerned, she was scared for what had happened on Friday, but now here on the Sunday morning, it was a reoccurrence of the earthquake. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, he rolled back the stone and he sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Yeah, Mary might have been a little tougher than the guards, but I'm sure she was still scared. I don't remember how many of you remember. I think it was probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I think there was an earthquake that took place with the epicenter up in Ottawa, Canada there. But I remember that day because it was one of those cases where I had a bottle of water sitting by me. I was doing something, and all of a sudden, I saw the water inside the bottle just start to move. And I was like, that's not right. What's going on? You know, and then all of social media and everything just kind of exploded in regards, did you feel that? Did you, in places that were closer to the epicenter, just that whole idea of an earthquake. And I've never been close to the real one. I've never been close to one where it's moved anything off a dresser or shelves, or not even slightly like that. But here there was an earthquake that allowed this large boulder that was in front of the tomb to move and open up the tomb. I'm not real tough, so I know that if I was in an earthquake, I'd be scared. I'm all right with that. I can imagine that Mary and the women were scared. In fact, Matthew tells us, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. You know the only reason I think you tell somebody not to be afraid? It's because they look afraid. That's why you say don't be afraid. A little later on in Matthew 28, he records, so the woman hurried away from the tomb. Afraid, yet filled with joy. Afraid, yet filled with joy. So she was fearful, she was scared. Mary is there outside the tomb. And she's crying. In fact, she's more than crying, she's sobbing. She's overwhelmed with grief because she has come to do the only thing that she knows she could do, and that is to prepare the body, to anoint it with the oil and the spices that you do for a loved one when they die. And in coming to do that last loving act, the body she's looking for, she cannot find. And I believe the grief of not being able to do that, with not knowing where Jesus was, where the body was laid, caused such emotional grief and sobbing. She just fell to the ground. This wasn't just some tears down the side of her cheeks. This was great sobbing, crying. I remember the first funeral I did when I entered into ministry was a 16-year-old fatality of a car accident. And I remember the night before the funeral. Visitation had been in the funeral home. The funeral was going to be at the church, so the casket was going to be closed for the last time at the funeral home. And I remember her older brother, when it was time to go and they were saying their goodbyes, he held on to her body on the casket, and when he could hold on no longer, he fell to the ground just clinging to the casket, not wanting to let go. It's that kind of a picture I get of Mary as she's looking for Jesus. She's just so overwhelmed with emotion. And she cries out to this individual that they have taken his body and I don't know where they've put him. She's just looking for him to be able to anoint his body, to put on the spices and the perfume. So it's dark. Mary believed Jesus was dead. Mary was scared. Fourthly, why does she think it's the gardener? She was in a garden. And it's a rather practical thing that, if you go to a garden, you would think to find a gardener. If I go to get gas, I would think to find a gas attendant. If I go to a restaurant, I would think to find a waiter or a waitress. I don't want a gas attendant giving me my meal. I don't know whether or not I want a waiter or waitress putting my gas in the car. I could probably live with that. But this is a garden. She would assume that, this is the beginning of the day. The gardener would be coming to look after things. John tells us she turned around and she just saw this figure. And maybe she didn't look real closely. Maybe she just kind of a quick glance. Remember, her vision gets blurry in her grief. Maybe she just doesn't get a good picture, but she just kind of, okay, there's somebody there as the gardener. Tell me where his body is and I'll go get it. But then, as we looked at earlier, seeing Jesus, when he called out and said, Mary, she realized it was him. Well, what are some of the reasons that we can mistake Jesus? What are some of the reasons why we don't see him? You know what? Sometimes it's because it's dark. We talked about this when we talked about the garden of death. The fact is that life is difficult. The fact is that life is not the way it was intended to be. Life gets hard. Life has suffering. It has illnesses. It has acts that are done by people that are nowhere close to being godly. There are economic hardships. There's divorce. There's death. All of this is difficult. All of this is darkness. The circumstances of life can quickly darken our world so that we're unable to see Jesus. The things that are in the dark can distract our attention so we don't really see Jesus for who he is. Jesus is thought to be dead. Just as Mary had thought that Jesus was dead, that his body would be in a tomb, there are people that still see Jesus as being maybe not dead, but for one reason or another, they're dead. He's dead to them. He's of no use. He's of no benefit. They've asked and prayed prayers that haven't received answers, and because of that, they've concluded that Jesus is dead. Maybe they followed him at one time, but then it seemed that they were hurt more than they were helped. And Jesus becomes dead to them. Some have simply made that decision that they're going to live their life their way, and so they, in essence, crucify Jesus all over again and say, "You're dead to me." Some have evaluated how tough it is to really follow Jesus in our world today and have determined that the price is too high. And they put Jesus aside and consider him dead to them. Some don't see Jesus because they're overwhelmed. Life just gets so heavy. Things take place, circumstances, situations. So much goes on trying to cope with life that they simply get overwhelmed and they're unable to see themselves anywhere, let alone in relationship to Jesus. They're unable to see how things will work out, how they'll get themselves out of debt, how they'll get themselves on the right track, how they'll be able to fix things that have been broken. And because they're overwhelmed with all these other things, they're not able to see Jesus. Sometimes we're overwhelmed because we need to make choice. And when we have to make choices, sometimes that weight is upon us in such a way that the ramifications, if we make one choice as opposed to another, it just overwhelms us in such a way that we can't see Jesus and we don't seek him out. Look around us, we see all kinds of people that are overwhelmed with stress, overwhelmed with dealing with the daily grind of life, and they're not able to recognize Jesus because they're simply overwhelmed. Some never are able to see Jesus because of wrong expectations. And we have to admit this morning, we come up with expectations of Jesus. We come up with expectations of what we want Jesus to be, what we want him to do. Some come up with expectations that Jesus is simply a ruler maker, that he says you do this and do this and do this, but you don't do that, and you don't do that, and you don't do that. And that's all they see him as a ruler maker. Someone to be feared, someone who's going to bring judgment, someone who's going to whack their knuckles because they've got it out of line. Someone that's simply waiting for you to make a mistake. Judge you, bring punishment. Others see Jesus as their own personal Santa Claus or genie, where they continually come to him looking for special granting of wishes and wants and favors. And they pray asking for Jesus to fix this, do that, make this go away. And when he doesn't, they give up. Wrong expectations. Expectations that Jesus would be their personal servant. Look after them in all things. Make life easy. Wrong expectations. Other ways that we can mistake seeing Jesus or not seeing Jesus is turning away from Jesus. That first time, for whatever reason, Mary looked and she saw this individual who was Jesus, but she turned away. And there's some who have simply turned away from Jesus. They don't see him. They don't see any benefit from Jesus. They don't see any relationship with him. In our first service, we talked about Mary when she turned the second time in responding to Jesus' voice. How everything changes. My desire for each one of us this morning is that we would not remain in the dark, that we would not think that Christ is dead, that we would not be overwhelmed with life, that we would not have wrong expectations, that we would not turn away from Him, but rather we would turn to Him. That we would cry out, Teacher, Lord, Savior, Loved One. That we would be able to answer others when they come to us and they say, why do you do what you do? Why do you live the way you live? Why do you have a relationship with Jesus? That we would be able to say, as the hymn writer recorded in those words we sung as we concluded that first service, and we'll sing in a moment. Yes, I can give you all the facts as to why Jesus is alive, but most importantly, the reason that Jesus lives and the reason that I know He lives is because He lives within my heart. Because He walks with me and He talks with me. That's how I know He lives. Yeah, I know all the facts. I know all the things that are recorded for in Scripture. I've heard them. I've experienced them. I've gone through them. Listen, 51 years I've probably gone through Easters in church. But that's not enough. How I know He lives is because He lives in my heart. Let's stand together and sing triumphantly. He lives.